Pine needles crunched under my heavy boots, brittle with the morning frost. I was a man built for the high timber, made of silence, wind, and cracked leather. Love wasn't anywhere in my vocabulary until a quiet whisper cut through the cold, making a fool out of me. Frost clung to the mule's rigging like a second skin. I pulled the cinch tight, ignoring the dull ache in my left shoulder that always flared up when the wind shifted north. Up here on the ridge, the air tasted like crushed iron and pine resin. It was clean, uncomplicated. Down in the valley, where the settlement of Bitter Creek sat like a dark stain against the snow crust, things were different. I hated going down. But a man can't eat beaver pelts, and my flour barrel was echoing hollow. The descent took 3 days of fighting mud and slick rock. By the time I led my 2-pack mules onto the muddy thoroughfare of Bitter Creek, my teeth were vibrating from the cold and my boots were soaked through. The town smelled of burning coal, wet dog hair, and sour beer from the saloon. It was loud, too loud. A blacksmith's hammer cracked against an anvil, and wagon wheels sucked in the frozen mud. I pulled my collar up, keeping my eyes fixed on the boardwalk ahead. Stone's Mercantile sat at the edge of town, its wide windows clouded with condensation. I tied the mules to the hitching post, grabbed the heavy canvas bundle of winter furs, and pushed the door open. The brass bell overhead clattered, grating on my nerves. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cinnamon bark, oiled canvas, and kerosene. Christina Stone was behind the counter. She wasn't one of those delicate porcelain women you saw in the Sears Roebuck catalogs. Christina had shoulders built for work. Her dark hair was pinned back haphazardly, a few loose strands clinging to the damp skin of her neck. She was hauling a 50-pound sack of oats off a handcart, her breath hitching slightly with the effort. I stepped forward to help, but stopped. Harlan Boone was already there. Harlan owned a cattle spread east of town. He smelled of expensive bay rum, damp wool, and unearned confidence. He stood too close to the counter, leaning on his elbows, watching Christina struggle with the oats, instead of offering a hand. "I'm just saying, Christina." Harlan's voice was a low, irritating drawl. "Winter's setting in hard. Your father's gone. The bank's looking at this property. You can't run a mercantile on your own. It ain't proper." Christina dropped the oat sack onto the floorboards with a heavy thud. A cloud of dust rose around her skirts. She wiped her hands on her apron. They were red at the knuckles, calloused. The skin dried out from lye soap. "I'm doing just fine, Harlan," she said. Her voice was flat, exhausted. She didn't look at him. She looked at the ledger book on the counter. "I'll have the mortgage payment by the end of the month." "You don't have to worry about payments," Harlan insisted, reaching out to cover her hand with his. "Marry me. You move out to the ranch. I'll hire a boy to run this store. You won't ever have to lift an oat sack again." Christina stared at his hand. She didn't pull away immediately, but her jaw tightened. The muscle feathered under her cheek. I recognized the look. It was the same look a trapped fox gives, right before it chews its own leg off. I dropped my bundle of furs onto the counter. The heavy slap of dead weight against the oak boards made Harlan jump backward. "Need flour," I said, my voice sounding rougher than usual from days of disuse. 50 pounds. Salt pork, coffee, and a box of .44 caliber shells. Harlan glared at me. I stood a head taller than him, wrapped in a buffalo coat that smelled like old blood and wood smoke. I didn't blink. I just stared at the knot of his silk tie until he cleared his throat, muttered something about coming back later, and pushed his way out the door. The bell clattered violently in his wake. Christina let out a slow, shaking breath. She didn't thank me. I didn't expect her to. "Got some prime winter beaver here," I muttered, untying the canvas cord. "Should cover the supplies, plus some extra in hard currency." Christina ran her fingers over the thick, dark fur. Her touch was gentle, deliberate. "It's good work, Gordon," she said quietly. "Nobody sets a trap line like you. These will fetch a high price in Denver." She moved around the store, gathering my supplies. I watched her. I couldn't help it. There was a quiet dignity to the way she worked, a stubborn rhythm. When she brought the coffee tins back, she slipped. Just a fraction of an inch on the slick floorboards. I reached out, catching her by the elbow. Her arm was solid beneath the thin cotton of her sleeve. She looked up at me, her brown eyes wide, startled. Up close, I could see the dark circles under her eyes, the exhaustion pulling at the corners of her mouth. She smelled like dried apples and cold rain. I let go immediately, stepping back so fast my boot heel caught a barrel. I felt the heat rise in the back of my neck. "Careful," I grunted, looking down at my muddy boots. "Thank you," she breathed. She arranged the items on the counter, her hands shaking slightly. "You heading back up the ridge today?" I looked toward the front window. The sky had turned the color of bruised iron. The wind was picking up, rattling the glass in its frame. "Don't think so," I said, a pit forming in my stomach. "Storm's coming fast. The pass will be blinded out before noon." Christina looked out the window, then back at me. "The livery is full. The stagecoach got stranded here last night. They took all the stalls." She chewed her bottom lip. It was chapped. "You can put your mules in my back shed. It ain't insulated, but it keeps the wind off." "I can sleep in the loft," I offered quickly. I didn't want charity, and I didn't want to intrude. "Keep an eye on the animals." She nodded once, a sharp, practical movement. "Round back, Gordon. I'll unlock the gate." The blizzard hit with the violence of a swung axe. By nightfall, you couldn't see the mercantile from the shed, even though they were only 20 yards apart. The wind howled through the gaps in the warped wooden siding, throwing handfuls of fine, powdery snow across the dirt floor. I had bedded the mules down with fresh straw and rigged up a small sheet iron stove I found in the corner. I sat on an overturned crate, using a dull knife to scrape mud out of my boot treads. My hands were stiff with cold, the knuckles aching. The shed smelled of manure, wet canvas, and the sharp tang of coal smoke from the little stove. I wasn't a man who minded being alone. I preferred it. The trees didn't ask questions. The mountains didn't care if you were ugly, or poor, or awkward. But sitting in that freezing shed, listening to the wind tear at the roof, a heavy, hollow feeling settled in my chest. I thought about Harlan Boone's hand on Christina's. I thought about how easy it would be for her to just say yes. She wouldn't have to freeze. She wouldn't have to haul oats. The heavy latch on the shed door rattled, snapping me out of my thoughts. The door pushed open, fighting against the snowdrift. Christina stumbled inside, leaning her weight against the wood to force it shut again. She was wrapped in a thick wool shawl, covered in snow, holding a cast-iron pot wrapped in a towel. "You didn't have to come out in this," I said, standing up quickly. I knocked my knife off the crate. It clattered into the dirt. I cursed under my breath, bending to pick it up, feeling clumsy and oversized in the small space. "You can't eat raw salt pork, Gordon," she said, her teeth chattering. She walked over to the stove and set the pot on top to keep it warm. She turned around, blowing into her cupped hands. "I've eaten worse," I mumbled. She offered a small, tired smile. "I brought you some venison stew and a couple of biscuits. They're a day old, but they're filling." I took the tin plate she handed me. The heat radiated through the metal, burning my cold palms in a good way. The smell of sage, cooked meat, and rich gravy hit the back of my throat. I hadn't eaten a hot meal cooked by someone else in over a year. I sat back down on the crate, taking a bite. It was the best thing I had ever tasted, but I didn't know how to say that without sounding like a fool, so I just nodded and kept eating. Christina didn't leave. She stood by the little stove, soaking up the meager heat. The lantern light caught the hollows of her cheeks. She looked smaller out here, stripped of the mercantile counter that served as her armor. "Harlan came back before the snow got too bad," she said quietly. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the glowing orange cracks in the iron stove. I stopped chewing. I swallowed hard, the stew, suddenly feeling like lead in my stomach. I set the spoon down. "Did he?" "He brought the bank papers. Showed me exactly what I owe." She crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "He said if I marry him by Christmas, he'll clear the debt. If I don't, the bank seizes the store by New Year's." My hands balled into fists on my knees. The leather of my gloves creaked. "That ain't a proposal. That's a threat." "It's survival," she corrected, her voice brittle. "I'm 28, Gordon. I'm tired. I wake up before the sun to freeze my hands in wash water, and I go to sleep with my back screaming. I don't have romantic notions left in me." She finally looked at me. Her eyes were shiny, reflecting the lantern light. He's a cruel man, but his house is warm. I looked down at the dirt floor. I felt a surge of useless anger. I wanted to punch Harlan Boone until his teeth rattled, but I was just a trapper. I owned 2 mules, a rifle, and a cabin that leaked when the snow melted. I had nothing to offer a woman, let alone a lifeline. I scraped my thumb over the edge of the tin plate. "You deserve better than a man who treats you like a ledger entry," I said. My voice was low, gravelly. I kept my eyes on the floor. "You're a strong woman, Christina. You're honest. You work harder than any man in this settlement." I forced myself to look up at her. The air in the shed felt incredibly thick, suffocating. I cleared my throat, forcing the words past the dry lump in my neck. I said, "Whoever marries you will be lucky." The wind screamed outside, battering the walls, but inside the shed, it went completely, utterly silent. The pop of a green spark inside the stove sounded like a gunshot. Christina stood perfectly still. The shawl had slipped off her shoulders, pooling around her waist. She stared at me, the tension draining out of her face, replaced by something raw and completely undefended. She took a step toward me. The rustle of her heavy wool skirt seemed impossibly loud. She stopped, just inches away from my boots. She looked down at my battered hands, then up to my face. "I was hoping it would be you," she whispered. My heart slammed against my ribs. It physically hurt. I froze. A hero in a dime novel would have stood up, swept her into his arms, and made a promise. I didn't. I sat there like a stunned ox. My breath caught in my throat. I knocked the tin plate off my knee, the leftover stew spilling into the dirt and straw with a wet splat. I stuttered, my voice cracking. I wiped my hands furiously on the thighs of my denim trousers, suddenly acutely aware of how dirty I was, how I smelled of mules and sweat and isolation. "Christina, I ain't. I live in a shack. I ain't got money for banks." She knelt down in front of me. She didn't care about the spilled stew or the mud on the hem of her dress. She reached out, her rough, lie-chapped hands taking hold of my large, scarred ones. Her grip was strong. "I didn't ask for money, Gordon," she said, her voice shaking now, a desperate edge to it. "I asked for you." I looked at our hands. The contrast of her pale, raw skin against my dirt-stained knuckles. The heat of her touch sent a shockwave up my arms. I realized, sitting there in the freezing shed, smelling of horsehair and wet wool, that I was terrified, not of the winter, not of the mountain, but of the sudden, crushing weight of hope. I slowly turned my hands over, lacing my thick fingers through hers, gripping her back like I was dangling off the edge of a cliff. Morning broke like a fractured bone, sharp, white, and agonizing. Light poured through the cracks in the shed siding, glaring off the frost that had settled over my buffalo coat. I sat up, my joints cracking in protest. My breath bloomed in white plumes. The spot on the dirt floor where Christina had knelt was just a patch of cold earth now, but the memory of her grip still burned against my knuckles. I pulled a worn leather pouch from my saddlebag, dumped the contents onto the crate. 7 silver dollars, a handful of pennies, and a crumpled $5 bill. Added to the beaver furs, it was a respectable winter haul. It wasn't enough to buy out a mercantile mortgage. I looked at Buster and Jack, my mules. They were chewing lazily on the straw, their breath whistling through their wide nostrils. They were ugly, mean-tempered, and loyal. I looked at the heavy canvas wrap, leaning against the corner of the shed, containing my traps. Heavy iron, forged in St. Louis, rusted from river water and blood. Finally, my eyes landed on the leather scabbard resting near my boots. Inside was a heavy-barrel Sharps rifle, custom-set triggers. Walnut stock rubbed smooth by my own jawbone. It had kept me breathing through 5 winters, dropped elk at 400 yards, and spoke the only language the high country respected. I closed my eyes. The shed smelled of manure and cold ash. I felt a sick, twisting knot in my gut. I hated this town. I hated the mud, the noise, the cramped, suffocating buildings. But I remembered the desperate, raw sound of Christina's voice. "I asked for you." I didn't feel like a savior. I felt like a man walking to the gallows of his own free will. I strapped on my boots, hauled the heavy furs onto my shoulder, grabbed the mule's lead ropes, and tucked the rifle under my arm. The snow was knee-deep, a blinding expanse that hid the frozen mud. I waded through it, leading the mules toward the center of Bitter Creek. The air was so cold it felt like inhaling ground glass. Elias Finch ran the livery and the assayer's office. The building smelled of ammonia, damp hay, and chewing tobacco. Finch was a small, rat-faced man who always looked at you like he was calculating your scrap value. 40 for the furs, Finch muttered, poking at the beaver pelts with a dirty finger. 50. They're prime, I rasped. My throat was still tight, and I'm selling the mules and the rigging. Finch stopped poking the furs. He looked up, his pale eyes narrowing. He looked at Buster and Jack, then back to me. You selling your animals, Gordon? How you getting back up the ridge? I ain't. The words tasted like ash. What are they worth to you? Finch rubbed his stubbled chin. He knew he had me. He could smell the desperation, even if I kept my face carved out of granite. 80 for the pair, 10 for the rigging. It was robbery. They were worth twice that. I didn't argue. I just nodded. Now the rifle, I said, sliding the heavy sharps from its scabbard. The oiled steel gleamed in the dim light of the livery. I laid it on the counter. My hand didn't want to let go of the stock. My fingers cramped, rebelling against my brain. I forced them open. Finch actually whistled. He reached out, running a hand over the barrel. That's a beautiful piece of machinery, Gordon. Man doesn't part with a gun like this unless he's dying or in trouble. Just give me a price. By the time I walked out of the livery, my pockets were heavy with hard currency and paper notes, but my hands were completely empty. The wind whipped around the corner of the building, biting into my coat. I felt naked without the weight of the rifle, unbalanced without the lead ropes in my hand. I had sold my livelihood. I had sold the only life I knew. I trudged toward the Bitter Creek bank. The heavy oak doors were imposing, designed to make a man feel small. I walked inside. The heat from the potbelly stove hit me first, followed by the smell of cigar smoke and lemon oil. The bank manager, a soft man with soft hands, looked at me like I was a stray dog that had wandered onto his parlor rug. I didn't take off my hat. I walked straight to the mahogany counter, pulled the wad of bills and heavy coins from my pocket, and dropped it onto the polished wood. The thud was deeply satisfying. "Christina Stone," I said, my voice low and grating. "I'm paying her note, in full." The manager blinked, completely caught off guard. He looked at the dirty money, then at my scarred, weather-beaten face. "Mr. Boone has already expressed intent to assume that debt by—" "Mr. Boone ain't here," I cut him off, leaning forward until my chest pressed against the counter. "The money is. Draw up the deed, release. Now." Walking back to the mercantile, the town seemed different. It wasn't just loud and dirty anymore. It was real. I had bought a piece of it, or at least, I had bought Christina's freedom from it. My boots crunched heavily through the packed snow on the boardwalk. I held a folded piece of heavy parchment in my left hand. It felt thinner than my rifle, but infinitely heavier. Through the frosted front window of the store, I saw two figures, Christina, standing behind her counter, and Harlan Boone, wearing a heavy, fur-lined coat, leaning over the ledger. A hot, ugly spike of anger drove itself into my chest. I didn't storm in. I pushed the door open slowly. The brass bell clattered, an irritating tinny sound that made Harlan turn around. The store smelled exactly as it had yesterday: cinnamon, canvas, kerosene. Christina looked exhausted. Her eyes darted to me, widening slightly as she noticed my empty hands. No rifle. No mules tied up front. "We're closed, trapper," Harlan sneered, turning back to Christina. He rested his hand on the counter, inches from hers. "Christina and I are discussing business. Family business." I didn't say a word. I walked down the center aisle, my boots thudding rhythmically against the floorboards. I stopped a foot away from Harlan. He was a wealthy man, used to people shrinking when he spoke. I didn't shrink. I just stared down at him, breathing slowly through my nose. "I paid her note," I said. I tossed the folded parchment onto the counter. It slid across the smooth wood and stopped against the inkwell. Harlan stared at the paper. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh, reaching out to snatch the deed release. His eyes scanned the ink. His face flushed a dark, mottled red. "Where did you get this kind of money?" Harlan spat, dropping the paper. He stepped toward me, throwing his shoulders back, trying to reclaim his territory. "You're a filthy squatter. You steal this?" I didn't throw a punch. Fighting was for drunks in the saloon. I just reached out, my thick fingers clamping down onto the heavy wool lapel of his expensive coat. I didn't grab him fast. I grabbed him deliberately, twisting the fabric so it dug tight into his neck. Harlan gasped, his hands coming up to grab my wrist. He smelled of fear and Old Bay rum. "You're standing in Christina's store," I growled, my voice barely above a whisper. The silence in the room was suffocating. I leaned in so close he could smell the stale tobacco and cold iron on my breath. "She doesn't owe the bank. She doesn't owe you. If I see you on this boardwalk again, I won't use my hands. We understand each other?" Harlan's eyes darted frantically. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing against my knuckles. He gave a jerky, pathetic nod. I released him, shoving him backward slightly. He stumbled against a barrel of nails, caught his balance, and scurried out the door without looking back. The bell jingled violently as the door slammed shut. The silence returned, heavier this time. I stood there, staring at the door. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in my gut. I looked at my hands. They were trembling slightly. I shoved them deep into the pockets of my buffalo coat. I turned to look at Christina. She was staring at the paper on the counter. She reached out, tracing the official bank seal with a shaking, calloused finger. She didn't look triumphant. She looked shattered. "Gordon," she whispered. She finally raised her eyes to mine. "Your mules. Your sharps. Where are they?" "Gone," I said flatly. I couldn't sugarcoat it. I didn't know how. "Sold them to Finch." She covered her mouth with her hand. A tear spilled over her lashes, cutting a clean track down her dusty cheek. "You sold your livelihood. You gave up the mountain. For this?" She gestured weakly to the drafty store, the half-empty shelves, the heavy sack of oats. "For a broken-down mercantile?" "No." I took a step closer to the counter. The wood separated us, but the distance felt smaller now. "I did it for you." She shook her head, a desperate, confused motion. "You hate this town. You told me once the air down here chokes you. I can't. I can't let you be trapped here, Gordon. Not for my sake." I pulled my hands out of my pockets. I placed them flat on the counter, leaning my weight against the oak. "I ain't trapped, Christina." I looked around the room. I saw the peeling paint on the ceiling, the warped floorboards, the drafty windows. It was ugly. It was a cage. But then I looked back at her. The dark circles under her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way her hair curled damply against her neck. "A man can survive a long time in the timber," I said slowly, the words feeling foreign and heavy on my tongue. "He can eat salt pork and sleep in the snow, but he ain't really living. He's just waiting." I reached across the ledger book. I didn't ask for permission. I laid my scarred, dirt-stained hand over hers. She didn't pull away. She turned her hand over, intertwining her fingers with mine, gripping me tight enough to bruise. "I don't know how to run a store," I muttered, looking down at our joined hands. "I'll probably break half the inventory." Christina let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. She squeezed my hand, leaning her weight forward until her forehead rested against my knuckles. "You can do the heavy lifting," she whispered against my skin. "I'll handle the ledgers." I closed my eyes. The brass bell was quiet. The wind howled outside, throwing snow against the glass. But the draft didn't seem so bitter anymore. I didn't have a rifle. I didn't have a horse. I had no idea what the hell I was going to do tomorrow. But as Christina's thumb traced the rough scars on the back of my hand, grounding me, pulling me out of the cold and into the quiet reality of her presence, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't waiting anymore. If this gritty tale of survival and unspoken love struck a chord with you, don't leave just yet. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who appreciates a real, grounded Western story. Your support helps us keep the campfire burning and bring more raw, untamed romances to life. Drop a comment below. Would you have braved the winter for Christina? Stay tuned for the next chapter. And until then, keep riding the trail.